And now I'm going to change gears a little bit, and I will present you what we're doing in our group, which is called the Music Perception and Processing Lab. So as I said, we are funded by a Freigeist Fellowship from the Volkswagen Foundation. And we started off in 2020, running right into the pandemic as we started. So we needed to change a lot of plans we had. But I'm going to try to give you an update of what we're working on. And then you'll also see the most important people here, the PhD students involved in the lab, to give you a short account of what they're working on these days. The basic question that we're asking in this project is, look, you're in this concert, you're sitting at the back, and what you see in front of you is an audience that is at times, let's say, above 50, right? And we all know that people in this audience might have difficulties hearing out the violin parts from this violin concerto that they are about to hear very soon. And we're asking how much of this violin will actually be represented in their brain when they listen to this concert, which not only has the violin, but also a massive orchestral accompaniment. So that's a basic question that we're asking in this project. What about the sound of music for hearing impaired listeners? What's actually going on when people lose hearing and when they still try to listen to music? And of course, hearing loss is nothing surprising to music history. It has been sort of intertwined with music history for a long time. Beethoven is the example probably for that. And today later, we will hear in much more detail by Bernhard Richter about Beethoven's case. But also today, hearing loss is, of course, an issue. Sound levels are increasing on stage. And here we see the example of Brian Johnson, singer of a famous rock group, who needed to quit performing because he couldn't hear his fellow musicians anymore. The whole topic has also been recently taken up by Hollywood. So if you have not seen this movie, I think it's quite interesting sound design here. So it's a story of a metal drummer who loses hearing. And so the whole situation, I think, is becoming more considered in the public domain as well. If we jump back into the research world, then there's of course a literature also on these issues. We're not claiming here that we're the first ones to do this, not at all. So there have been interesting surveys and lab experiments on this topic. For example, Sarah Madsen and Brian Moore did a survey on music and hearing aids, where they had a very rich array of findings, one of which was that live music is a serious issue for hearing aids due to distortion. Alinka Greasley will hopefully tell us more about her study in her talk later, and she also saw very diverse experiences of patients and audiologists when it comes to hearing aids and music. More detailed lab experiments include the one by Kirchberger and Russo, notably their adaptive music perception task, where they found that basically all musical dimensions that are based on discriminating frequency features are affected by hearing loss. So there, in these frequency feature dimensions, people with hearing loss and people without hearing loss performed very differently. And Jonathan Weisberg looked at commercial hearing aids and what their music programs did to music sound quality. And he found that these music programs in commercially available hearing aids only inconsistently improve musical sound quality, which means that when you get your hearing aid, and you switch on your music program, it's not really clear whether it will improve your sound quality or not. Meaning there's still a lot more to do. Currently, we're still in the process of running a larger survey to characterize the situation in Germany, together with the Deutsche Orchesterverband and the Deutsche Chorverband, so the German Orchestral Society and the German Choir Society. Please come see our poster. I just want to mention 3 points that I find interesting. So the first one is on hearing protection. So around 50% of our respondents, so these are all professional orchestral musicians, like they play in German orchestras for a living. And 50% of them say that they have trouble, or problems at least, using hearing protection because they can't hear their fellow musicians. Then we asked them whether they had been diagnosed a hearing loss, and 28% of our respondents said they had diagnosed hearing loss. So if we go to a concert in Germany, we can say every 4th musician has an issue with hearing. And regarding the aspect of hearing aids, we asked whether they feared losing respect among colleagues when they would wear hearing aids on stage. And around 40%, or a little bit more than 40%, responded that this was the case. So we seem to have, we seem to observe this stigma related to hearing aids, which we, of course, also expected to some extent. But this is, of course, affecting a daily life of professional musicians in a quite profound way. There are much more aspects to discuss here. I think we should do that at the poster. Okay, let me just try to draw a brief comparison to speech. So I've been talking about music perception and hearing loss so far. And in speech, it's very clear that problems with speech understandings arise when it comes to complex acoustic situations, essentially when auditory scene analysis is involved. So when the components of multiple sound sources need to be disentangled. And that's very intuitive. People know it from sort of their basic intuition that once it gets noisy, speech is hard to understand, and this is even more a problem for hearing impaired people, of course. So one perspective that we're exploring in our project is this basic analogy to see how much this also holds for music. So auditory scene analysis, just to give you a brief definition of that term, denotes the ways in which the ear and the brain make sense of sound mixtures. We have usually in music, we encounter mixes from multiple instruments. They overlap in time, but also in frequency, and this makes auditory scene analysis a very difficult problem. And then the ear is supposed to make sense of these mixtures. And of course, the information that the brain receives for this process is very different if we compare normal hearing people and hearing impaired people. And our question is, how is sensorineural hearing loss affecting this process, and what happens with auditory scene analysis and the perception of music when hearing gets impaired? I mean, I don't need to tell you, I guess, that polyphonic music is at the heart of at least Western musical tradition. There's evidence for notated polyphony dates back to the 10th century. Here, this piece was discovered rather recently, where some German monks close to Düsseldorf, I think, notated very early signs of polyphony. So it has been, of course, intertwined with music history in the West for forever, so to say. The fact that we rather prefer multiple things happening at the same time in music compared to just one thing. And research on musical scene analysis also has quite a history. So there's a seminal article by Stephen McAdams and Al Breckman from 1979, Hearing Musical Streams, where they outline various musical scenarios where auditory scene analysis is really essential. David Huron then derived traditional voice leading principles from the foundations of auditory scene analysis. And other authors like Daniel Presnitzer, Clara Suit, and Shiab Sharma outlined how the multiple affordances of music can give rise to ambiguity and thus pleasure. So the link that we're making is to connect auditory scene analysis research in music with hearing impairment. And our basic hypothesis is that processes of perceptual organization are a critical aspect of why music listening is difficult for hearing impaired listeners and how music processing for hearing aids may be improved. Okay, I see I'm running out of time to get into the details here, but just to mention two projects that we previously worked on. Gunther already mentioned this paper. Here we basically characterized musical scene analysis abilities as a measure of signal masker level ratio, so sort of an analogy to the speech recognition thresholds, where we can objectively quantify differences between different groups of subjects. And what we found there was that hearing impairment and combined with age in this sample actually had a big issue or had a big effect on these melody and timbre perception tasks, so differences of 10 dB of signal to masker level ratio. And we also saw that hearing impaired listeners cannot as easily make sense of segregation cues, so dips in the signal compared to normal hearing listeners. In a more ecological scenario, we also looked at Bach's Art of the Fugue and tracked listeners' performance in following individual voices in these polyphonies. I must skip the details for the sake of time. Here we also observed that timbre cues didn't help hearing impaired listeners, whereas they helped normal hearing listeners. And we also observed that hearing aids didn't really help, although I must say this was a sort of a study that was heavily affected by the pandemic. So there we would need to follow up with a larger N for that claim. Okay, let me briefly transition to what we're currently doing and what the whole team is doing. We're not only looking at Bach or sort of artificial stimulus scenarios, but these days we're working a lot with popular music excerpts. So this I would call our standard model of music. Of course, popular music is ubiquitous everywhere. And acoustically, it can be roughly characterized as often comprising a percussive, impulsive drum track. It comprises usually low frequency bass instruments, accompanying instruments like the guitar and keyboards, and it also usually features lead vocals. And we'll hear in a second about the specific role of lead vocals. We're here using mostly the medley database, which is a multi-track data set for popular music, which is quite handy in that respect. Okay, so regarding the structure of or our map of the different research projects that we're looking at in the lab, we could divide that into a microscopic and macroscopic approach, and into a perception and processing stream, so to say. When it comes to macroscopic aspects, Robin will tell you in a second about a project looking at individual differences in auditory scene analysis. Then a microscopic approach to auditory scene analysis is to consider attention effects in musical scenes, and Michel will tell you about that in a second. Then we have the processing stream where Aravindan is going to tell you about approaches to remixing, also which is sort of more macroscopic, and then looking at the microscopic features that identify musical instruments. Simon will tell you about his project as well. So with this, I hope to have given you an overview of sort of the general approach, what we do here. And now I would like to invite the team to come up and just give you more insights of what they do.
Thank you, Michel. 1 second. So, hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robin Hake, and I come from a psychological background. And with this background, I'm looking at individual differences in auditory scene analysis in the context of music for normal hearing and hearing impaired individuals. And thank you, Kai, for this nice introduction into auditory scene analysis, because now for you, it's of no surprise that music psychology has long acknowledged the fundamental role of auditory scene analysis in music. However, there have been no standardized tests to quantify this ability in normal hearing or hearing impaired participant yet. So our objective was first to develop such a test to quantify this ability for normal hearing and for hearing impaired participant. And on top of that, we want to have it efficiently, so adaptive. And yeah, so I show you what we have done and give you a broad overview. Or maybe first, why we use music for that. I mean, why we look into auditory scene analysis and use music as a stimuli. And music is actually a quite nice way of investigating this, because it arguably provides some of the most complex acoustic scene that a human listener will ever encounter. So as a test paradigm to investigate this ability, we opted for an A, not A task that required participants to decide whether a single target instrument was part of a mixture of instruments. So we can separate the task in 3 parts. So at first we have a target instrument, a 2-second sequence of a target instrument. Then we have a short pause of 1 second, and then we have a mixture of instruments. And then the participants get asked, was this target instrument embedded in the mixture of instrument, yes or no? So pretty straightforward. But nonetheless, let's have a look how it looks for the participants. So just 2 short examples of the test itself. So in order to tailor the test difficulty to participants with different ability levels, namely normal hearing and hearing impaired participants, the excerpts, so in total we constructed 400 items, varied in terms of the choice of the target instruments, lead voice, guitar, bass, and piano, the number of instruments in the mixture, varying between 3 and 6 instruments in the mix, and the level ratio between the target and the mixture, between 0 and minus 15 decibel. Within the framework of a calibration phase, we recruited over 500 normal hearing and 100 hearing impaired participants for an online experiment. And let's hop into the results. So what you can see here is the performance of these participants on the y-axis and the condition on the x-axis. And for this, namely the parameter of the choice of the target instrument. And what you can see is that the lead vocals are detected most easily for all the participants. Sometimes even 100% of items were correctly identified. While, for example, the bass is identified most difficultly. Piano and guitar is somewhere in between. And hearing impaired participants have more difficulty identifying the stimuli, the target instrument. Here, the second parameter, the number of instruments in the mixture, are presented, showing that more complex scenes with 6 instruments in the mixture are more difficult than simple scenes with 3 instruments in the mixture, which is maybe often no surprise. And also, the last parameter has a significant influence, showing that with decreasing or increasing the level ratio between the target and the mixture, it becomes increasingly difficult to identify the instrument. So all 3 parameters that we employed are helpful to identify or to differentiate between the abilities of the individuals. So, and based on this calibration, we developed an adaptive version of the MSA. We call it musical scene analysis task, and used this for an in-lab validation experiment. And there we recruited old hearing impaired participants, old normal hearing participants, young normal hearing participants, and also 1 young hearing impaired participant. And for that we wanted to try to establish estimations for test-retest reliability, but we also included a large battery of psychoacoustic tests, speech and noise tests, and also other musical related tests like timbre perception, melody discrimination, and so on. And if you're interested to see the results of this experiment, you can come to my poster later on. Yeah, so thank you, and I give the word to Michel.
Thank you, Robin. Hello, I'm Michel, a hobby bassist and also known for creating overly complicated board games. I started in Kali Labs about 3 years ago as a student assistant after my master's in audiology, and then I became a PhD student a few months afterwards. Whereas Robin investigates the detection of cued instruments, I investigate on the ability of instruments and singing voices to attract the auditory attention of the listener, and how this influences the hearability of instruments and which acoustical features of the instruments are attracting the listener's attention. We have conducted several experiments using a paradigm similar to Robin. So listeners had to detect a single target instrument or singing voice in a mixture of multiple instruments. And we splitted the participants into 2 groups. Participants either received prior knowledge which instrument to attend to before the mixture was presented. In this case, they could use the knowledge as a searchlight to spot the target in the mixture. And I want to simulate this paradigm by presenting an example. If you like, you can listen carefully and try to detect the target. For the audience, please raise your hand if you think the target is in the mixture. For everyone not raising their hand, I automatically assume otherwise. So, forced choice, if you. And yeah, I play the sound now. So listen carefully.
Everything was clear to.
Yeah. I think this one was quite obvious. It was in the mix. For the other half of the participants, no prior cue was given, so they listened blindly, and the detection of the instrument was based on its ability to attract the listener's attention. 2 more examples, same rules as before. I see 1 raised hand. Yeah, that's correct. The target was in the mixture. And another example. This also was in the mixture, yeah. So maybe you get an idea that this way around it seemed to be much harder. So the results showed that not only did the singing voice perform best in the experiments, but they were also the only target where only minor difference was found when no prior cue about the target was given. So this indicates that in musical scenes, the listener's attention seems to be automatically drawn towards the singing voice. We then analyzed features of the singing voice that could provide this unique vocal salience and investigated if transferring those features to other instruments would also transfer its ability to attract the auditory attention, just like the singing voices. In a published paper, we explored if the vocal salience is a product of sound mixing by, for one, looking at the spectral composition of instruments in the mix to investigate if the vocal advantage is an effect of spectral masking. And we also investigated if the vocal salience is based on its favorable sound level. So, and we've done this by aligning the sound level ratios between the target and the mixtures for all targets. In a paper currently under review and showcased on my poster, in the poster session, we further explored the melody of the singing voice, its phonologic features, and frequency modulations inherent in the voice caused by the imperfect control of intonation. And despite my first assumptions, not the phonologic features of the voice, but the transfer of the frequency modulations showed to be the distinguishing feature that helped instruments to move into the foreground of the musical scene. Our current project is aiming to investigate whether we can support the results found in an electrophysiological experiment. So yeah, if you're interested to know more about auditory attention in pop music, feel free to have a chat, visit me on the poster, or just write me an email. Thank you.
Hello there, I'm Aravindan. I come from an engineering background. I joined Kai's lab around 2 years ago as a PhD student. I'm currently working on understanding multi-track mixing preferences of hearing impaired listeners to formulate automatic mixing systems for such listeners. Multi-track mixing is a very important practice for music production. As it requires much effort, automating it is very important, very beneficial. A handful of such systems were tested, but only on normal hearing participants. Research in cochlear implantees suggests that such listeners would benefit from specially made mixes, so bespoke mixes. However, similar studies on non-cochlear implantees, on non-cochlear implantee hearing impaired listeners is rather sparse. Here we test the mixing preferences of normal hearing and hearing impaired listeners without cochlear implants. So this study would serve as a primary step towards understanding and creating intelligent mixing systems for such hearing impaired listeners. The following audio effects were tested. So the first effect was the lead to accompaniment ratio, which is the ratio of the broadband levels of the lead vocals with respect to the accompaniment. And then the next effect that we tested, audio effect that we tested, was the spectral balance. That will occur as a result of mixing. So the spectral balance is merely the slope of the filter applied to the final mix. A positive spectral balance would indicate high pass filtering and a negative, a low pass filtering on the original tracks. So I would like to give an example of a positive spectral balance.
My happy arms will hold you.
And a negative.
My happy arms will hold you.
And then the last audio effect that we tested was EQ transform, which is the percentage by which an equalization of the factory or the mix made by a mixing engineer is linearly extrapolated. So this is done on an average spectrum between an average spectrum of commonly occurring instruments, such as lead, bass, guitar, drums, guitar, and synth instruments. And the original and the equalization in the factory mix, which will serve as 100%, which is the between 0%, which is the average spectrum, and 100% factory spectrum. And these are the examples. I would like to start with the original multi-track.
My happy arms will hold you.
So this is 100%, and if you go 300%.
My happy arms will hold you.
And last but not least is minus 200%. Two experiments were conducted. The experiments were conducted in a no reflection chamber with audio presented over a pair of loudspeakers. In the first experiment, 26 normal hearing participants, 10 mild hearing impaired participants, and 10 moderate to severe hearing impaired participants took part. The participants rotate a dial to render the real-time realization of an audio effect. He or she is then requested to retain the dial position and press next to indicate what they best prefer. We saw interesting trends in the data from the first experiment. In the second experiment, the same was performed only on hearing impaired participants with bilateral hearing aids. 11 participants took part in this experiment. 1 was mild hearing impaired, and the other 10 were moderate and severe hearing impaired. Significant effects were seen, as we can see, in all 3 audio effects, with and without hearing aids. If you'd like to learn more about the study and what I've discovered, please visit me at my poster or send me an email. Thank you very much. I'd like to pass on to Simon Jacobsen.
Hi, I'm Simon, and I studied engineering physics here in Oldenburg and joined Kai's group in 2020 as part of my master's thesis. And I'm a hobby trombonist and interested in the perception of musical instruments. When looking at studies on music perception, typically only few and rather controlled sounds are being used to represent a chosen instrument. And in this sense, these sounds are mostly described by a source filter model, where periodic source signal is filtered by a type of resonator. And under this assumption, the spectral fine structure or fundamental frequency is or can be decoupled from the spectral envelope, which is a smooth representation of the spectrum, basically describing the harmonic content. But my question is, are these sounds really that rigid, or is there actually interaction between effects of F0, instrument register, and dynamic playing level? In a JASA paper from last year, together with Kai and Christoph Reuter from Vienna, we investigated a large set of instrument sounds from 50 instruments found in the Western Symphonic Orchestra. And the sounds were taken from the Vienna Symphonic Library and included 3 dynamic levels. Although we found that spectral envelopes distinguished the instruments from all 12 classes, their shapes were not invariant to changes in F0 within the instrument. So depicted here as the spectrocentroid over fundamental frequency, you can see varying trajectories are visible for different instruments or instrument classes. Furthermore, we also found that dynamic playing level has a strong effect on the spectral envelope shape. As part of my master thesis, I further investigated the behavior of spectral envelopes with respect to F0. And I created a 2-dimensional component space using principal component analysis, which basically revealed instrument clusters. And these instruments, or the clusters, they showed varying cluster dispersion or size, and their class membership could mainly be explained or described by the cluster location. To evaluate these sounds perceptually, I resynthesized the component space with matching and not matching F0 and spectral envelope pairings. Here, small effects were seen when asking for sound pleasantness ratings. Very interestingly, the perception of auditory brightness correlated with the major dimension in the acoustical statistics of these sounds. Right now, I'm taking a closer look at individual instruments and resynthesize them with spectral envelopes taken from particular register anchors. And doing so, local and instrument-dependent effects on pleasantness ratings can be seen. Overall, these findings, or my findings, suggest that there is a constrained codependence between fundamental frequency and spectral envelope. And this furthermore demonstrates the fine details and variations in the rather broad palette of instrument timbres. With all these findings in mind, I'm now heading in the direction of my PhD project, in which I will be modeling the identification of musical instruments under realistic acoustical conditions. And as a compositional basis, the overture of the opera Tristan and Isolde by Richard Wagner will be used to investigate musical scene perception. And the stimuli will actually be taken directly from the score and presented in a virtual but realistic rendering of a concert hall. And my goal is to quantify human listener performance and create a binaural computational model for the identification task. So if you're interested in musical scene and instrument perception, come talk to me. I don't have a poster, but yeah, you just talk to me or contact me otherwise. And actually after this workshop, I will be on my way to Montreal in Canada to construct the stimuli that I will be using in my project. Thank you.